Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the panel on the right of access in practice. So my name is Ausloos. I'm a researcher at the University of Leuven Center for IT and IP Law. And so this panel came about after some research we did at the center last year on, as you might have guessed, the right of access. So everyone sort of assumes that the right of access, data subject rights in general, are not really respected as they should in practice. And there's a lot of anecdotal evidence suggesting that is indeed the case. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that from Paul-Olivier later on. But when you go look for it, there hasn't been much systematic empirical research trying to map this. And there have been some studies. The VUB, for example, has done quite an extensive study on CCTV footage access requests. But anyway, what we focused on was the online services context and trying to map compliance levels with the right of access and right to erasure as well, in fact. And in order to do so, we worked with 3 students following our advanced master's program, so already not your average data subject. And we collected the results, put them in an academic piece that will be published in the next issue of IDPL, but a working draft is already available on SSRN. So, just a taste of the findings. We investigated around 60 online service providers, of which only 2/3 provided clear guidance on how to actually file your access request in their privacy policy. It's quite problematic if you think that the right of access is often, or is actually generally the first step in exercising any data subject rights, right to erasure, right to object, soon the right to data portability. So if that's already not very clear, how is this going to work for these other rights? Not one provider gave a one-shot complete answer, so complete in the sense of all the categories listed in the directive. For each and every one of them, it was necessary to engage in email exchange often to get to the point. And these interactions were often very frustrating. Again, dissuading an average data subject. 74 response rate, 74%. Quite astonishing if you think that the study took place over a period of 5 months and we send regular reminders, so around every 2 weeks or so. So after 5 months, over a quarter of controllers didn't even bother to send, hello, we received your request. The vast majority responded via email, but there was a huge divergence in the actual format, as well as the level of detail, as you might imagine. So plain text in the body of the email as an attachment, PDF, Excel, and so on. Which also raises some questions if you want to automate this process. And before I move on, I do want to give you a taste of the actual responses that we received from some of these providers, which is quite, if it wasn't so serious, you could see it as funny, actually. One of them said, yeah, we really don't have time for this, please check our privacy policy, right? Another one said, this type of legislation is the reason we incorporated our company in the US and not in Belgium. In reality, real users never ask for this type of information, they just delete their account. Which points to another interesting problem we encountered with several controllers. And several of them, their reaction was, we've gone ahead and erased your data, which is also quite problematic. Imagine you file an access request and the reaction you get is, we've deleted everything. And then perhaps my favorite answer is, I can't manage to motivate the developers. Right? Also, interesting response. All right, moving on to the panelists. We have a great panel with refreshing perspectives on the topic. First of all, we'll hear from Paul-Olivier Dehaye, who is a mathematician by education, but since a year or 2 or 3, got very interested, very passionate in data protection rights, the right of access in particular, data portability, and anyone even vaguely interested in this field will have come across his name, certainly if you're on Twitter in the past year. He has filed hundreds of access requests, and his work has been written about in The Guardian and other reputable news outlets. Then we'll hear from Hal Hudson at the other end of the table, who's a journalist at The Economist. Some of you might know him from the piece he did with Julia Powells on the deal on between the UK's NHS and Google DeepMind on sharing patient data. And so Hal's very interested in investigative data journalism, and so he'll talk about the role the right of access can play in that context. Thirdly, we'll hear from Alison Howard, who is Assistant General Counsel in Privacy and Regulatory Affairs at Microsoft, and she's leading the company's efforts on the GDPR. So she'll be very well positioned in giving the perspective of the controller, right, on how they receive and accommodate these rights. And then finally, we'll hear from Edina Harbinja from Hertfordshire University. Her research and her PhD also focused on post-mortem privacy, and that's another interesting use case and the role of the right of access in that context. And so finally, the panel will be moderated by Priscilla de Locht from EDPS. That's it for the people. The concept of the panel is to have very brief interventions, so 5-7 minutes at most, no slides, hopefully very provocative to maximize the time for an interesting debate. So there'll be plenty of time for Q&A. Remember, though, that you are being recorded. So I invite you all to send an access request with the Cpdp organizers after the panel. But for now, I pass the floor to Paul-Olivier. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll make sure that you can do it through my tool. So I have a few points that I would like to make. The first one is that the right of access is really only the starting point, I think, of a better data protection enforcement regime, a better relationship to the digital world for individuals with the digital world. So why is that? Because usually the objection that I hear to my vision or my views of the right of access is that it's useless to people. It's useless to the average person. They have their data, and then what? They don't know what to do with it. Well, at least they have their data, and then they can decide who they trust and who they share it with to do something with it. And there are lots of actors who are actually very willing to do something with that. So journalists, NGOs, educators, academics, unions, etc., etc. And sometimes it's just one person doing the effort and getting, a raw PDF, whatever. Just that's already concrete for others to talk about. And I've done it several times where you just show a slide with your own data, and this has a big impact. So I'll talk about a concrete example later. Now, of course, as Jeff said, it's extremely difficult to use the right in practice. And actually, to expand on this, I'm always amazed by the huge disconnect on the perception of the exercise of the right by different parties, by different sides. So to some people, everything's peachy and it's really easy to exercise the right of access. It's in the law, that's it. No, it's not like that. Often you have to actually explain to the data controllers their obligations that they are completely unaware of. You have to argue the case, you have to say, there's so much friction. So that's what we want to do with Personal Data IO, my company, where we actually want to take this friction out. What we're building is a system that helps people automate subject access requests for themselves or for others, and where the whole educational component, for instance, on the data controller side, is taken over by a bot that just helps people comply, but that also helps people make the request and helps mediate this interaction for greater efficiency. So just to give you two examples of where the subject access requests have been helpful. The first one is with Tinder. So maybe some of you have heard, but a journalist, a female journalist, asked for her data from Tinder, and this was a very difficult process. She had to play the journalist's card. She had to say that she was writing a story about their non-compliance with data protection laws. She had to do all of this to eventually get some data. And then she got her data, and she told a very personal story, a very personal view on her raw data, which showed all the weaknesses that she was exposing to Tinder, and that she could discern. Maybe Tinder is using those weaknesses. Maybe Tinder is trying to. Maybe not. But at least she showed some hints of the power that this data represents over her. And that led actually to several hundreds of people coming to us, to Personal Data I/O, to wanting to do the same requests. Because they wanted to show in their school, because they wanted to do a story in their own language, because, well, all kinds of reasons. And this was for Tinder, this was for Snapchat, Instagram. People started thinking, okay, what could I do with this? And I think that's actually great, because it makes for a more informed public on those topics. The second one was at Cambridge Analytica, where I found some people in the US who were willing to do subject access requests. I paid for them myself, in the UK with Cambridge Analytica, this company that helped in the US election. So Cambridge Analytica had no clue about what their legal obligations were on this topic. Now there's CEOs going around saying the GDPR is the greatest thing about empowering citizens, which is laughable, of course, but at the time they had no clue. And when they actually answered the request, they made several mistakes, including the fact that they were building political profiles of US citizens in the UK, which is highly doubtful that this is actually legal, the way they were doing it. So now this is leading to a lawsuit in the UK. It was funded to the tune of something like £50,000, and eventually might lead to a class action. That's just one person or a handful of people exercising their rights, which might have a very significant effect in the future. So just to conclude, the future use cases that I can see are in general this tool acting as a microscope for the digital ecosystem of personalization. If you want to understand what personalization does, the only way you can do it, the only way others can explain it to you, is by starting with access requests. And the second thing is that the portability right can be used also in this context, can be combined. Because of course, lots of people could do access requests and then do the manual work of transferring that information to journalists, etc., academics, to explain to them what personalization means. But you could also use portability to do that transfer. And that might get to some very interesting results.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting, very short into the time. So may I ask Hal to intervene? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Priscilla. Can you hear me? Yes, good. So my name is Hal Hudson. I am the Economist technology correspondent. And my interest in all of this is stories. Stories about some of the most powerful companies on the planet. And the problem with the tech platforms at the moment, apart from their size, is that currently they do their best to avoid sitting under any particular regulatory regime. Oil companies have particular environmental regs they have to meet, energy utilities have particular pricing regs they have to meet, and telecoms have regulations they have to meet as well. All of that gives us as journalists handles, ways to investigate them, ways to file, to see things that they file to regulators. Unfortunately, for the most part, the tech companies don't have any of those obligations at the minute, and so this makes them large and slippery. Some stats, 73% of all digital advertising in the US is controlled by Google and Facebook, and 67% of adults in the US get news from social media. So that just gives you some hint of the kind of strength that these companies hold. Now, it's not only the lack of regulations that is the problem, it's also the fact that their businesses as digital platforms are abstract. If these were companies with factories, I could go stand outside the factory and ask workers coming out of it at 5 p.m. when the bell goes to talk to me. If these were oil companies, I could talk to people who live nearby them and say, have you seen any pollution? Is this bothering you? What's going on? But these are digital companies, and humans don't really have a digital sense. And so they're much harder to get a handle on, even through traditional shoe leather reporting. I presume that many in the room would agree that a lot of tech reporting today is effectively stenography, even to the kind of, it looks a lot like White House correspondence. You just sit in a room and you say what the gods are telling you. And that's not just because, tech is a world of gizmos and boys' toys and all these other problematic things that probably we won't go into today, but it's because reporting about what's actually going on inside these companies is not very easy. Their policies, why they're doing things, and how they're doing things are kept hidden from public view because it's not advantageous to the companies to disclose them. And so my interest in being here today and in speaking on this panel is, apart from telling you all what I want, is to learn more about what I can do to use subject access to get better insight into these platforms. Now, access rights are definitely a way to take a look inside there. The form I've used, or the rights I've used more often are FOIA. And there's an important point for a journalist, which is the framing through which that information comes to you. If I do a Freedom of Information Act request, I get, I guess you could call it sort of God view information. I get documents from inside the organization. I get, broader sets of information than if I do a subject access request. And even though Paul and some journalist collaborators have had good success with asking for their own data, it's quite problematic as a journalist to ask for your own data and write a story based on your own data, because it makes it hard to be objective. And my goal is to discern the policies inside these platforms. And so I'm not really interested in what it thinks about me. I'm interested in what it thinks about people in general. I'm not really much of a concern. For starters, I'm a white man who's 29. It's not particularly interesting what you do to me. I'm much more interested in, say, how you treat certain minorities, people with ethnic names, people who live in certain postcodes. I can't find that out by doing subject access requests on my own. I can only find it out by doing subject access requests with or in collaboration, groups of people, ideally that are statistically representative of the population at large or the population that I'm interested in. And so this individual nature is a problem. I think that what I would ideally like is for Paul's tool or other tools to evolve into effectively a way of running something like a class action data subject access request. I want to be able to spin up groups. A really good example just happened on Twitter this week, which was there was a little mini scandal in the UK around Admiral, which is a Welsh insurance company. And some people found out that they were getting insurance quotes that sort of didn't seem to make sense. And The Sun, which is a British tabloid, did a story saying that if you have essentially an ethnic or an Asian or a Muslim name, you will get a worse quote than if you have a sort of British sounding name. And so I tested this out. I put in exactly the same information manually for a Mr. Mohammed Khan and a Mr. John Smith. And yeah, lo and behold, John Smith got £1,000 a year cheaper insurance, even though his phone number, email, and everything was the same. But the problem with that is that when you talk to Admiral, they say, oh, well, the reason for that is because we use a third-party credit rating agency, and the problem is that there used to be a Mr. Smith, probably, who lived at this address, but there was never a Mr. Khan, so that's why. It's because Mr. Mohammed Khan is less of a person than Mr. John Smith. So you need proper access rights in order to discern these questions. But the tweets that I sent out got about 700 or 800 retweets. I would love to be able to turn that into something that actually brought real data back, not just kind of surface level Twitter interest. And so that's kind of why I'm here and what I'm hoping to learn more about.
Okay, thank you very much. Everyone is very disciplined, perfect on time. So, Ms. Howard, would you like to introduce?
Thank you, and thanks for having me. I wanted to hit on a couple of areas, and first to sort of highlight why it's important for Microsoft and other big service providers to be as simple and as comprehensive as we can be in responding to data subject requests, not just access, but other ones as well. And for us, the key thing, and Paul mentioned, emphasized trust. Trust is a big part of the business we do with consumers and with enterprise customers. And without transparency, you can't have trust. And so access is a key to that transparency. So that's why we have done a lot of work already in dealing with access and also preparing for the GDPR. From the top down, our CEO, Satya Nadella, has been committed to the GDPR, the senior leadership team, on down through hundreds of engineers, which we can motivate some of those engineers. And then Microsoft, we have about 150 privacy professionals, including me, who are dedicated to getting this right. And part of it is really focusing on what the customer wants. And so we have tools that we've developed and that we continue to develop to enable that. I will say that there are challenges in making this as simple and as comprehensive as possible. Some of those are making making sure you're talking to the right person. So if personal data IO is representing somebody, we need to make sure that you have the rights to do that, so that we're not providing personal data to someone that's not their personal data. I mean, the Article 15 of the GDPR talks about that and not affecting the rights and freedoms of others, and so we're very aware of that. Another point is really understanding the request, and this goes to why we don't have the one-shot answer in responding to requests, because we want to make sure that what we're providing is really what somebody wants. And if someone is asking for all data, we need to make sure that is that really what they want, or is it specifically they just want their Xbox gamer scores, and how those have been developed, for example. And then the third challenging area I think for a lot of companies is being able to pull the data from a lot of diverse systems. Companies have a lot of personal data, and it will be in different locations. Microsoft has a lot of different companies, so a lot of different services. So if you've got data that's coming in Xbox, that's in a different place than data for Skype or Windows, for example. So some of the things that we're trying to do to address it is, again, with a very a strong focus on the customer. What do they really care about? And in a lot of cases, it's their content. So if you're uploading files to OneDrive, you're able to access those there, you're able to delete those there, you're able to download those there and take them somewhere else. And so that's sort of our first level. The next level is what we have. We have a privacy dashboard that we've had for a couple of years and is in a continual cycle of improvement. If you go to privacy.microsoft.com, which is our privacy hub, you can access the dashboard from there. You can also access our privacy statement, which is a Microsoft privacy statement that covers all of our products and services, which I know one thing from the report was sometimes that's a challenge, but we do try to do a layered approach so that if you care about Bing, you can click on information about Bing. If you care about how we're using your data, there's a drawer that gets you into that information. And then the site also has our privacy principles and controls, transparency, security. I think all go to being able to support access rights. And then if you go to the dashboard, you'll see. I mean, it's a developing area. I mean, we have some topics, some data categories that we address there, and we focus on being able to allow the individual to get that data on their own, to delete it on their own, to access it. In some cases, they can download copies. But we recognize that's not the end. I mean, we prioritize the types of data that we think people care most about, so search, browse, location, voice. We'll be adding to that, and so just watch this space. But there's also other data that Microsoft collects that we don't have in the dashboard yet, and so for that we have a manual process, and this is probably where a lot more of the not one-shot answer comes in, where we have a privacy response center that you can access through the privacy statement that gets you to a team of support professionals who know how to handle personal data requests. If you go to support generally, they should know to get you to that team. So that's some of another challenge is making sure that we have the training for the people to get the answers, so that there isn't really a runaround in customer service. And it was interesting reading the study, which I think is really helpful. And so when it's final, I definitely will be sharing it with colleagues. Like, okay, what are some of the things and the recommendations that the paper recommends that we really should be doing, or we should focus a little bit more on? I mean, it's a challenge to be able to handle both volume and comprehension, and so to be able to take guidance like the paper and experiences that other folks are having is something that will help our product in the end by becoming more responsive. I think that's probably one other thing I do want to point out. I mean, Microsoft is a controller, and so that's where we have the data subject requests that we will address directly. But we also focus a lot on our commercial customers who are controllers themselves, and so trying to provide tools for them so that they can respond to data subject requests from either their customers or their employees is another area of focus for us. So, I mean, we take our learnings from our position as a controller to be able to help enable our customers' compliance as well. So I think that's one way that companies like personaldata.io and other companies that are helping other controllers to be able to respond to these requests, I think will help lift us all in the end.
Okay. Thank you very much. Edina, may I ask you to
Sure.
follow up? Thank you.
Okay, a little bit of an academic perspective. Now that I think I'm going to open some questions as well, and then obviously you will be asking as well. So again, thanks Jeff for the paper. That was really, really helpful, and the data that they provided in the paper opened up my eyes as well and opened up some questions for me. So Jeff was complaining in one of his comments about data controller wanted to erase the data even though the access was requested. Didn't you want the right to be forgotten in the first place when you advocated? So the first overarching theme from the paper, and what we, I think, here as well should recognize, is that the right to access personal data is a precondition to other rights, such as the right to erasure, such as the right to portability, data portability, rectification, objection, explanation, etc. So various rights under Articles 15 to 22 GDPR. So that is why this right, even though might seem dry, is really crucial. Another precondition that Jeff and his colleague talk about in the paper is enforcement and compliance, where they, and Hal was talking about that, and Paul as well as Alison, and actually all of them. So they gave an example of Schrems and Facebook in his data access request that led to what we know is invalidation of the safe harbor regime. So these two themes, I think, are important, and I would like, again, to point them out, even though when you read the paper, you will, it will be very obvious. Secondly, I would like to thank Jeff again for letting me bring in some of my research. And you might find it very, very relevant, but I'm going to try and make some connections. So my research is on post-mortem privacy and deceased data. So you would say, well, what the hell? They're not data subjects under GDPR. No, they're not. But Recital 27 allows member states to introduce some sort of protection for deceased data, and France, Hungary, Spain, and some other countries have already done that and have been quite post-mortem privacy protective, and France in particular. I'm writing a paper on that with my colleagues from France. So in order to enable this sort of protection and access to deceased data, and some of that can be obviously very lucrative and related to estate planning and succession of digital assets and our digital wealth, again, data subject access right can help the deceased, obviously before they die, when they're thinking about estate planning, and their solicitors, their lawyers, to actually know what is out there in those services and whether that has some, obviously, lucrative monetary value or only personal, and what we should do with that. Building on that, there are some good examples on how this particular area is handled with obviously potentials for improvement, and I must say that Google and Facebook, with their services such as an active account manager and legacy contact, where there are forms on how you can sort of decide what happens on some of that data post-mortem. So maybe that sort of template, those sort of templates and processes can be used and replicate in a way with all the flaws to data subject access requests and templates that could be used and could be more simple for the data subject to use after May, from May onwards this year. I would like now to just respond briefly, so leaving post-mortem privacy and the lessons we can learn from them, if you think it's relevant at all, responding to some of the fellow panelists' contributions. So for Paul, I think the tool is really, really important and very, very helpful. Should be used more, should be popularized more. And my question for him would be, have you had any access requests for the data that you hold, if you collect and hold on the service? If I can just,
yeah, sure.
I just ask the questions and then maybe we can go on. And the second one is just that I saw in your form, in your template, there is a mention of safe harbor, so please correct that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a suggestion in a public one. For Hal, and I think it's really important, again, when he talked about the business and being abstract and being obscure, not being able to find information and how to access the data, if not only your data, but other people's data. I think there's many issues with that, and I'm not defending the industry, on the contrary, but there are issues with obviously trade secrets, breach of confidence, intellectual property, many, many other issues in accessing other stuff that is not your personal data. However, I think there is scope for Hal, and that's a positive side for me, to work with people like Jeff and his research project on this, and Leuven and similar research projects, as well as Paul, so collaborative effort in order to get more data and to get more insight and to get more research done. So that's how I see it. Obviously, other people can comment. For Microsoft and Alison, I think it's very helpful that they're thinking of data subject access rights, and well, they should have had the process already, and they do have because of the DPD as well, but it will be changed. My question, it relates, one is related to identity and verifying identity of the data subject. So how will you make sure that you don't generate excessive correspondence with this back and forth, asking for more data, and again, processing even more data, and then disclosing more data to them? So the vicious circle. Also, what is your thinking about the format of the data subject access requests, as well as the data that you will provide? So in Just Paper, we could see there was email text, there was PDF, there were URLs, they were in-service solutions, very, very different ways and very unintelligible ways of providing that. And again, a more general question for Alison is that now you have the obligation, according to Article 12 of GDPR, to facilitate this process. So you not just need to respond, but you need to be seen as facilitating and complying. So how will you make sure of that? As well as with regards to time, the maximum is 1 month plus 2 months potentially if with other conditions being met. So do you have any information so far? How fast have you responded as Microsoft, and whether this was within those 30 days, and whether 30 days would be a problem for you as a company to respond to that? I think that is enough for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Edina, and thank you to all the speakers for this very interesting presentation, which I'm sure has raised many questions amongst you, and Edina already started with many of them I have. So before giving the floor to the audience, I would suggest to ask each speaker to answer the questions Edina has mentioned. So let's start with Paul, because you were the first one.
So yeah, we didn't have any access request yet. We did get some deletion requests, which I fully understand. I mean, the people have to give a lot of information in order to obtain more. And of course, the people using this tool now are more sensitive about their data. So it makes sense that they use the service once and then they want to delete. This being said, please do access requests to us, actually. Sign up to our mailing list, do access requests. And why do I say that? Because it allows us to test all processors' practices. Now, currently, when you sign a contract with a processor, in order to use the processor says, we comply with all relevant regulations, we encourage access rights, etc. They have a process in place. I don't know how much of automation they have on that side to answer requests. But I would like to know if MailChimp, for instance, could answer thousands of requests that would come to them. So the only way I can test that is in practice, if people do access requests to personal data IO.
On the point of collaborating with academics, I'm absolutely up for that. I think there's a lot of upside, because journalists are looking for a story, academics are looking for a different kind of story, but there's significant overlap there. The problem comes, and Paul and I have already actually run into this in a story we were working on, which is that if I want to know about how, say, Airbnb hosts are processed by Airbnb, the platform, how do I get access to that data as a journalist? It's not my personal data. I don't really have any legal rights to see it. And so there has to be some kind of separate agreement between Paul's platform, the subjects, and me, which says something along the lines of you can see this much of the data and no more, or you can see these bits of the data, and but you can't see, the personal data. And frankly, I don't care about, someone's Xbox gamer score or the photos they've uploaded to Google Photos. I don't care at all about what the actual content of the data is. I care about the operations that have happened upon the data. I care about the policies and the logic of processing. So for me, that's the kind of stuff I'm interested in, and it's also the kind of stuff, as I understand, that is harder to get.
It's just, if I can jump in. So we had this discussion, it's interesting to expose. So we have to specify a purpose to people in order to share the raw data with you. So the natural purpose would be so the Economist can write a story, but that might not be in the interest of the data subject. If the Airbnb hosts are not paying taxes, for instance, and that's what you want to uncover, then it's not in the interest of the hosts to disclose to the Economist. Okay, so then that would mean that the agreement is we share with the Economist only if the purpose is to write a positive story about the hosts, and that the Economist will say no, right? So it's a bit difficult to find the
middle ground.
Yeah,
I agree.
Okay, thank you for this exchange. There was still one question for you.
Yes.
Alison, maybe.
Yeah, I had a few questions for me. I have one question for Jeff is just the timing and where people can find the final version of the paper, if it's not available yet.
It's on SSRN already. It's on SSRN.
Okay.
Yeah, and in the next issue of International Data Privacy Law, it'll be published. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So Edina, thank you for your questions on verifying identity to make sure that we reduce the back and forth. On the dashboard that I described, that is because we're operating as a controller there and it's our consumer services, to be able to access it, you need to authenticate with your Microsoft account. So that is, that's a more straightforward way. If you have data that isn't available there but is associated with your Microsoft account, the Privacy Response Center knows how to handle the authentication in a secure way. If you've got requests that are based on something else, like an email address that is not tied to your Microsoft account, because you don't have a Microsoft account, but you were at a Microsoft event and you provided your email address and you want to see what data we have associated with that, there's a process for them as well. And so that's where there is a little bit of back and forth with the support staff to as part of kind of clarifying the request to make sure that we know, what identifiers are we talking about, what is the data that you're interested in, so that we can scope it to that. And we do need to make sure that it's something that we can authenticate in a way, even if it's not like an online sign-on, that if you just give us your phone number, we really don't know if that would be you or it could be an old phone number that I had. So there are some challenges in some areas that we wouldn't be able to authenticate in a way, especially to provide access to somebody if we don't know that that's the person. The format of the request itself, like I said, we're trying to do as much as we can through self-service tools. So it's not really a request; it's just you're going to a dashboard and it's saying, I want to delete this, or I want to access certain types of data. I want to download certain types of data, and that gets into the format. Right now on the privacy the privacy dashboard with the data that you can download right now is limited to search and to voice data, and it's in a JSON file, which is understandable, but not the best. So that is an area that we're working on. We are very focused on intelligibility of what we're providing, and that's why we prioritize some types of data above everything. Facilitating the process, right? The 1 month is a challenge. And that's another reason why we try to push as much as we can to the self-serve portal, because that is immediate there. And it also highlights why we have the exchange with the support folks to make sure that we understand the request, because if we understand the request, we can act on it more quickly. A lot of the engineering work that's going on right now is to make sure that data is inventoried, that it's tagged properly, that we can be able to, when we get a request in, we know, say it's a deletion request, there are delete agents that are agents being just software, not actual individuals, are going out and deleting that data. And similar, if we access that it's tagged in a way that we know we can pull it back in quickly. And so that's I mean, a lot of the infrastructure behind the dashboard and our GDPR compliance in general is to be able to make sure that we do know where that data is, we know who it's associated with, and we know what data category it is, so that when we have a request, we know what to look for and how to pull it back. But there are other ones I think I would also want to point out for deletion. I mean, deletion is kind of, you need to balance. You know, you don't want to delete data that individuals, obviously, if they have it in their OneDrive or their email, you know, we're not deleting that. The individual is deleting that. But you also need to, you know, for other personal data that's more on the back end, you can only retain it for as long as you have a purpose to retain it. And so we do delete data regularly through, you know, we have data retention schedules that we follow. So there's that. So there could be requests that come in and say, you know, I want this data, and it has been deleted just as a part of a you know, a standard process. It's not deleted in response to a request. Yeah, someone. I didn't phrase that the right way. I mean, we would delete data, but we don't delete data if someone comes in and says, okay, I want to access this data, and say, oh, funny, you know, we just deleted it. I mean, there's a process we follow so that we're systematic in how we're deleting data and minimizing data, but also being respectful of all the other data subject rights as well.
Okay, thank you very much. We still have 30 minutes for discussion. So if there is any questions in the audience, yes? Yes, first. Could you briefly introduce yourself? And there is no...
My name is John Grant. I work with Palantir. And my question is, for Hal, probably has to deal with this. Right of access only solves sort of part of the problem, or only delivers part of the value if the answer is yes, and you provide information and people get to see, okay, here's the data. My question is, what happens when the answer is no, we don't have any data, and that clashes, especially that class, people are healthily skeptical, which is good, you have to question that answer. But how do you prove that? How does a company that has data that says, no, we don't have any data on this person, how can you prove that to your satisfaction that that is actually true?
Through some kind of third party. I mean, a sort of more proven example is in FOIA. If someone comes back to me, and this happens all the time, by the way, FOIA responses are not reliable, not because anyone's being nefarious, just because it's not easy to, I mean, the kind of challenges that you're talking about with particular identifiers, particular things, it's not easy to find all the data you have on a certain thing. As far as I can think or tell, the only way is through, you know, in the case of the UK, appealing to the ICO, saying, like, I don't believe that this is the case for these reasons, and having them look at it independently. That takes absolutely months or years. Like, the ICO is massively overburdened. I'm sure that's the case for all DPAs everywhere. And they definitely don't have time to be dealing with sort of skeptical questions from nosy journalists.
There is a specific example in some markets. This data might be in different data controllers' databases, and the controllers also have the obligation of telling about sources and recipients of data or categories of recipients. So sometimes you have situations where A says they don't have data, and B says A gave us this data. So there's a contradiction there. So you have to go back to A and say, look, B just told me the opposite of what you did. This has happened to me.
Also, in our research, we also were confronted with that issue. How are you going, if you have a suspicion that it's not complete, how are you going to prove that? At least one way in which we try to sort of throw back the ball, if that's an expression, was if using Ghostery and seeing other third-party trackers on your website, and you didn't share them, at least that's something that you can prove black and white. But yeah, the rest is pretty tough.
And if I can just, before the next question, again, something you talked about and it's important and we didn't mention so far is the lack of harmonization in terms of enforcement between the data protection authorities. which will be a challenge, and obviously some work for the for the Data Protection Board and codes of conduct, perhaps in this area as well, to harmonize the practice. And yeah, as well as the disease data, there will be huge disharmonization within the EU. So another evidence that GDPR doesn't really help much in a lot of areas. Thank you.
Hello, Tobias Morsches from Datenschutzraum Germany. My question is, do you have any experience with data requests in a situation where you have pseudonymous or anonymous data and you would like to know about your data? You can't prove that this pseudonym belongs to you. How can you access your rights in this situation? Or do you don't have these rights if you use pseudonymous accounts?
Well, for anonymous, we wouldn't be able to do anything. For pseudonymous, it depends if we're in a position to identify the individual or not. And the GDPR does take into account that if you're not in a position to identify the individual, then you don't need to provide access or deletion, any of the data subject rights. So that, again, it's similar to the point I was trying to make earlier on deleting data versus retaining it so that we have it in response to an access request is, if we don't need to keep data in an identifiable format for longer than we do, then we shouldn't do that. But then we're in the position of having data that we're not in a position to identify, but it's still personal data. So it's subject to the other rights or the other obligations within the GDPR. But responding to data subject requests, if we're not in a position to identify, is again getting back to one of my earlier points, that we're not going to provide personal data to somebody who we don't know has the authority to get that data. And I think that may get to the challenges with post-mortem rights, to be able to make sure that if my heirs are going and they want my digital content, that Microsoft as a service provider has assurances that that's actually true, and it's not just, for example, a parent who may want to see what their child had on, in private chats, and the child really didn't want that to be shared. So it's
delegation.
Identity is a challenge.
Delegation, especially.
Yes.
Yeah. Which is present for minors, for dead people,
Yep.
for robots. Yeah. But to answer the pseudonymous question, yes, this happens all the time. The response you often get is, we don't have PII. We don't have personally identifiable information. But they do have pseudonymous data and a ton of personal data as a consequence. So yes, there are ways to get around this. Among other things, the example I was explaining with A and B, where one knows this pseudonymous identifier is linked to this actual identity in the real world. And so this is then passed on, some data is passed on to B, who just has the pseudonym, but that still makes it personal data for A to retrieve from B, all those situations. So yes, it happens, you just have to handle it properly. Yeah, but you can get access to that.
Okay, thanks. There was a lady here. Do you have
my hand up.
you have the micro, sorry, yeah, I couldn't see you. You are on the after, if you don't mind, sorry. Thank you.
On that direction, right after.
Okay, thank you.
I'm Joris van Hoboken from University of Amsterdam and Vrije Universiteit Brussels. I have a question. Maybe first, it seems Article 29 never wrote an opinion about access rights, which is somewhat surprising considering it's so basic. And should there be an opinion about access rights? My second question is about the scope of the right. And there's some, I think in practice also maybe we will see some influence of data portability rights which have a narrower scope. So I could see a situation emerge where a lot of controllers are maybe ready to respond to data access rights in the same way that they have to respond to data portability requests, which would be a little bit narrower. Is that a realistic kind of intuition that we may see that situation emerge in practice? And then, and how to prevent that? should we expect a lot of litigation about the scope of the personal data concept? So like that relates, of course, to the previous question of what is really included. You know, what should controllers really? What part of the data set should they control? Should they consider to be personal data that becomes subject to the access request rights? Thank you.
Yeah, well, for the first question, the right of access was mentioned in the opinion on the data portability, but there wasn't a separate one.
And the recent one on transparency as well.
And transparency.
But just 1-2 paragraphs.
Yeah, so it would be helpful if we had more guidance in the future.
In the portability guidance, specifically, there's a mention about all the problems of identification of individuals. And if you compare the draft to the final version, after the draft I submitted with another NGO, with an NGO, I submitted some opinion on the draft, which led to some changes in the final version to correct partly what you said. So Article 11 says that the companies have to be able to identify the person for pseudonymous data, but Article 11.2 says that if the data subject provides enough information to identify, then indeed the rights apply, which is exactly the situation in the pseudonymous case where you have to deal with it. And it's problematic because the company might have thought, oh, it's pseudonymous, so I will never get a request for this data because it's not identifiable. But they haven't fully understood the way their data is flowing around in the ecosystem that might still make it personal in some specific circumstances, which this is very relevant for some verticals like advertising.
Yeah, well, in association with any identifiers and other data that they might have and metadata, etc. So all the discussion about the concept of personal data comes in, and then the question and all the complexities there as well. And I see obviously potential and scope there for data controllers to argue their case that this is not personal data. I'm not sure about litigation complaints definitely with the data protection authorities. But there will be issues unless it's clarified. And in GDPR, it's a bit clearer than in DPD in that data controllers shouldn't be asking for excessive information in order to identify. They should be using their own means to identify the data subject. So we'll see how that works, really. I'm not sure if Alison has anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think one reason why the working party hasn't addressed access as a separate opinion, maybe because they view it as something that's been around since the directive, that even though that hasn't been harmonized, that's not part of their priority for a work plan. They have a lot of work to do, even getting guidance out as much as possible before May. But I mean, we have viewed the access right as really the broadest one, and it goes to points earlier about it's fundamental to the other ones. Well, you can request deletion of data without actually knowing what data a company may have or a controller may have for you, but really I think for other ones, especially for restriction or correction, that's access is a key part of that, and for making sure that sort of a checking compliance, that the company is doing what they're saying they're doing in their privacy statement, their privacy policy. The portability right, you're right that it is narrow. I mean, it's consent and the performance of a contract if those are the bases for the processing. I think there might be some tension between when controllers are relying on those two bases versus when an individual thinks, well, I should have this is the type of data that I think should be portable. But if you're relying on legitimate interest, technically you don't have to do that. So I think seeing how that plays out will be interesting. Again, I think it's an area where if individuals and customers are really saying this is something that I want to take somewhere else, and that there is more of a market, but an ecosystem that's supporting that, then I think there will be more pressure on companies to make sure that they are providing portability to right to personal data that may not technically be within the scope of it.
Just very quickly on the question about how far should access go, from my perspective, and this may be legally wrong, I don't even know, I think it should go as far as the individual impacts of the data that is held. So, if I can argue that your very esoteric digital profile of me it has an impact on my life, can materially impact me, I think I should be able to access that as a data subject. But I don't know whether that's correct or not.
So to make it concrete for Tinder's case, the original motivation was to get that journalist's attractivity score, according to Tinder, right? So that was her motivation. She wanted to talk about that score. That's the last thing Tinder wanted to talk about.
Which she did not explicitly contribute to that score.
Right, so that's a profile that's constructed from, I mean, they boasted about having an Elo score, like in chess, of people. So based on this Tinder game of liking or not, or swiping, they construct a score. You're a 7, you're a 9, you're a 6, right? And so that's why I helped her, because I knew this would be a huge motivator for people to get access, because they want to know their score, right? So the long back and forth, lots of interactions, lots of people asking for their score from Tinder. The response from Tinder is, we have a data subject rights that, by the way, they implemented just because people ask, where they can download some data. And what's in the data? Well, the data is just one way of the conversations people had. So it's the data they provided. Basically, they built the portability portal because they had pressure under the access right. There's a discrepancy here, but it's not structural. It's really Tinder's problem. They're not complying with the law. They get access requests, they respond with portability.
Sorry, just on that also the right to object and the right to explanation as well comes in with all the problems identified in many, many papers, in fact, adverts, etc. So I won't go into details, we have more questions, but on the consequences and rating the right potentially of explanation.
You had a question.
Good questions.
Thank you very much for bringing up the example of Tinder. Actually, I was going to ask you about that. My name is Marian Fernandez. I work for European Digital Rights EDRI. So my question is related to the previous discussion. So on the one hand, we have the raw data, and on the other hand, we have what we call in EDRI bastard data. So the data I provide to a company gets pregnant, and then they have babies. I don't know who the babies are. So as a user, I have an interest to know the bastard data that a company has. So in the case of Tinder, it's great because we know that they have the desirability score, but Judith didn't get it. She got 800 pages of data, but not that, which was what she was interested in. So my question is, what can we do to ensure that the companies actually apply the law? And what can Judith or any other person that will ask that from Tinder or any other company, what can we do to get this bastard data, which is the most interesting one in my view?
So, okay, when I started helping hundreds of people do access requests to Tinder, I knew fully well that this was a fiction. Tinder has no obligation, being based in Texas, to answer those requests. But also I knew about the corporate structure. So Tinder belongs to CiTiP, which belongs to Match. Those are French groups based in France. So at the same time as doing the access request to Tinder, I was doing it to CiTiP and Match. Because that's data, I mean, they will have to argue whether by doing an access request to CiTiP, you can get Tinder data, right? By the way, because I signed up for Tinder for scientific reasons, let's say, I started to get a ton of advertisements on Twitter for all the other companies from the Match group. So it's clear that there is data flows between those different companies. So the next step is to go and file, because Match and CiTiP never responded to those access requests. The next step is to go to the CNIL and say, here is 300 complaints about those companies because they're just not responding. This should be really easy for the CNIL to assess. Here's a request, never got a response. That's it. It's the matter of one email to those companies. But I haven't done it yet because I'm not sure the CNIL system can handle it. It will also dramatically affect their metrics of, their efficiency.
Okay. Thank you. There is someone here in the front that has raised his... Yes, thank you.
Hi, it's Giancarlo Margeri from VUB. So I was interested to another perspective, this the limitation of right to access for intellectual property rights or other interests, etc. So in your research, and on the other hand from the data controller side, how do you cope with this right to data access cannot infringe the copyright of software, cannot go beyond the trade secrets and so on. So have you found some data controller who actually told you, yeah, we cannot say you more, because there was the first case of Max Schrems and the EDPS opinion on trade secret directive. So he tried to access to Facebook and he said, no, you would not access because we have trade secrets on them. And so actually trade secret can cover everything. So that's why I was asking you. Thank you.
I can briefly respond. So no one provider, at least in our research, really brought that up as an argument. Maybe because at this stage it was still pretty basic. I think if you really try to dig in, right to explanation, or however you want to call it, like really like the whole logic behind automated processing, you might be confronted with that. Maybe worth mentioning another reply that I did get from Spotify. For example, I asked, could you explain why I am recommended this artist and not that artist, for example? And then, the only thing they said was basically, we base it on your listening history. Yeah, well, thanks for that. But, that is something worth exploring further, and at what point that you will bump into that argument. But we haven't encountered it so far, but maybe Paul-Olivier, have you seen that argument?
Well, I was going to make a point. Again, it's not a data subject request, but it was a Freedom of Information Act request to the Royal Free Hospital. I asked them for a thing called a data schema, which was basically the metadata that they provided to DeepMind so that synthetic data could be generated to train models. And they said that this was the intellectual property of Cerner, which is a health records company. But intellectual property doesn't mean that you can't respond to FOIA, so I see no reason why it should mean you can't respond to a subject access request. The whole point of IP is that I'm not allowed to then go and use it to start my business, but that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in writing a story about it. So I think that commercial sensitivity is the #1 BS response to information requests that I have encountered, so you've got to push back quite hard against it. Obviously, there are trade secrets, but the point of a trade secret is that it's not covered by patents. So if you've got a real trade secret that you don't have patents on, feel free, but most of the time, that's not necessarily how it's done. You know, if I ask Magic Leap how their secret heads-up display thing works, I'm pretty sure they're not going to tell me, but that's not what we're talking about here.
Yeah, so just on freedom of information, there's going to be some really interesting interplay for public-private partnerships where people do freedom of information requests on data protection impact assessments. That's going to be a fantastic opportunity to get some insights. For instance, TfL, I did that Transport for London, their Wi-Fi tracking. That was huge because it showed a lot of deficiencies in the way they were. So this was a public thing, but it was still already very helpful to understand the systems they were putting in place. And for the trade secrets aspect, it's under-tested. I think there will be a lot of contests there. It's going to be particularly curious if you combine it with the logic of the processing and the context of neural networks and all of those things, because they have some obligation to explain what they were doing, but at the same time they might deny access because they say they have trade secrets. So, but from my understanding, you cannot really put trade secrets on something you don't fully understand and you cannot explain. So, I mean, that's my interpretation. You have to dig deeper. You have to be an expert to dig deeper. But there's going to be some contradictions there.
Can I just add something before I ask Alison, and maybe she would like to intervene anyway. So, trade secrets, IP perhaps, and Alison maybe can respond on behalf of Microsoft, but also the rights and freedoms of others, so rights of privacy of other data subjects as well as free speech, and then plus the exemptions that member states can introduce, and that would create more problems in these areas. That we'll see how it goes.
And to the point, I mean, IP rights are called out specifically in the recital, so that's something that we would view as affecting the rights and freedoms of others. To be able to do that, though, we really need to be able to know that this is what we're relying on for not providing that information as part of a data subject request. So there's also a lot of work on that internally to make sure that what we're providing, if we're not providing everything, why are we not providing it, and how can we defend that and also be clear that there are some things that would be withheld. You know, security is another area that affects the rights and freedoms of others, especially both on an individual level and on an ecosystem level, that wouldn't be provided. But that doesn't mean that you get nothing. It means that things are kept back, but there's other data that you would be getting.
Yeah, and if you have delegation of access requests, and if you have a good framework there, there's going to be really interesting questions about the privacy of others. So, for instance, what if, recently there was a 10-year anniversary of friending who became my wife on Facebook. So Facebook showed me a summary of their understanding of my relationship with the person that became my wife. I might want to do an access right specifically on that edge, where Facebook has built a huge history on that and has tried to figure out what that relationship was, right? So if I do it on my own, Facebook is going to say, this is affecting the privacy of your wife. But if we do it together, what happens? But I mean, it's laughable maybe now, but when you have at home an Alexa that's listening to you, but not just to you, also to your wife and your children and everything, and you want to do an access right to understand what's being listened to, well, the response you get now is that we're not sure it's your data, it's not your wife's.
Okay, thank you. There were still two questions in the back. Yeah, two people raising their hand.
Thank you. Frederica from Privacy International. The question is building up on Jan's question. So in a way, the entire purpose of data protection is to regulate power asymmetries between data subjects and data controllers. In a way, a lot of the challenges you have to start from proving that data is personal data in the first place, to getting access to derived, inferred, and predicted categories of data, etc., place all of the burden on the individual to make that request. And I think the work that both Hal at The Economist and all of the work that you have done, Paul, has been amazing in this regard because it drew attention to this right, etc. But my question would still be, what needs to happen for this power imbalance to shift so that there's a very clear, so that not every single time you do a request, you have to argue that this is actually applicable, that there actually is personal data. And my question more specifically would be, do you think there needs to be guidance should we lobby for guidance from the working party? Do you think there should be legal precedents, certification schemes? What do you think can solve this problem that we're seeing at the moment?
Yeah, I'll start. I mean, I think that it's not that the controller would be saying it's not personal data, because personal data is defined very, very broadly. Even in the U.S., where historically we've thought about PII, personally identifiable information, at least in Microsoft, we have a view that that's, if you as an engineer are thinking of PII as something that names somebody, or it's your email address, it's your postal address, it's much broader than that. And so I don't think we get to a point where we're saying, no, that's not personal data. The challenge is making sure that it's your personal data, that we know we're giving it to the right person. I think, certifications, code of conduct, I think that would be a great approach. That I'm trying to think if that would be faster than working party guidance, just because there's so much that the working party is working on right now. But Microsoft, we have all sorts of certifications, so we know how to work with certifying bodies, and know how to provide the evidence that we are properly certified. So if there are efforts for certification on that, or even on codes of conduct that controllers could agree, this is a way that we can make sure that we're identifying the person properly, beyond straight authentication, for example. In more of the edge cases, I think that would be a great development.
So I think the edge cases are actually crucial, because the edge case, like a journalist helping people, or wanting a lot of people to do access requests, will lead to the most access requests from the perspective of the data controller, right? This is a reason why suddenly a data controller has hundreds of requests. So I think what needs to happen is actually to identify the different patterns that are important, like delegation, authentication, all those problems with words that make sense in the technical world. Then see what are the good
software practices around those patterns and realize those don't exist yet. Those are not implemented yet. But figure out a way to specify how those actually are done in the real world right now. So it might be that this particular step for this particular controller is mapped to a template, a letter template, a legal template that has to be signed by those actors, right? Or some mechanism like that. So it's not an API yet, but it's a pseudo API that maps to real world processes.
The blockchain. No.
Yeah, so actually that's something else I wanted to say, because actually, so if Microsoft says we have a problem to authenticate people, Microsoft does not need to know my ID. They don't need to know my ID to authenticate me. Some of the solutions that are being built are around Microsoft being able to verify that it's really me, or that someone, a third party, has trusted that this was my ID. Right? So it gets really complex technically. And that's what activists want, actually, not to have to send their ID everywhere, but to be able to verify to anyone that it's really them and it's tied to a real ID. So it gets complex, but we need to sit down and discuss all of this.
Just very quickly, I'd love to see data protection authorities become a little bit fiercer in terms of the kind of fluffiness that goes on at the early stages of a request, when there's lots of kind of, oh, we don't really know what you're talking about, oh, please define exactly what you want, oh no, we don't have that, and then you have to go round and round in circles, and that seems to me to be willfully against the purpose of the laws. So I would love to see DPAs be harsher towards that. It tends to be a discussion with DPAs about that, and it goes on forever. So currently that's useless. The companies will keep doing it for as long as they can.
Okay, thank you. We have 5 minutes left, so I suggest you pick one question. Should someone else also would like to ask? So, okay, you and... Okay, but then that's it. Thank you.
Hello, René Maillot, datarights.me, another platform in the making to sending access requests. I've been thinking a lot about this last question of Frederica about this fundamental question of power inequalities, and I'd like to actually second what Jeff just what just said. That it's very important that data subjects know that they have a DPA behind them in the final resort, and that it's actually pretty easy to do to get the help of the DPA when necessary, because after that happens, then they might not need it anymore. When companies know that when they really do obstructive bullshit, and then they know that if they do that, they will be kind of punished for that, or get the legal threat over them that is actually credible, then saying like, hey, this, I don't believe what you're saying and I'm going to go to the DPA becomes effective, by which you don't have to go to the DPA anymore. Before I was working in the financial sector in the Netherlands, where we had like a regulatory authority that was pretty strict. And the effect of that was that just by having a good case and saying, I will take this case to the authority, made that you didn't have to go to the authority, but you could just say that and the companies would then self-regulate.
So I explained the situation with the hundreds of requests waiting for the CNIL. And I've told the CNIL, look, you have to have an API. And I'm sure that if there is an API, they will soon realize, okay, we need to standardize this in the first place, in the exchange that's taking place. So it's the way to get the DPA behind is, unfortunately, to put pressure on them by overwhelming them with unstructured requests. Unfortunately, that seems to be the only way.
Can I also add some? So when you spoke about power asymmetries, there is a power asymmetry between the DPAs and the companies, obviously, and their resources. So there's only so much we can expect from the DPAs in the context of their resources, their priorities, and then obviously for companies, there is a question of their risk management and how much risk for certain breaches of our rights they can take and they're ready to take. And that was a very American perspective, obviously, power asymmetries. We talk here about human rights in Europe normally, but also, as we know, GDPR aims, in addition to protect human rights, to enable free flow of information. So we can't really forget the other side, I think, which might be dystopian a little bit.
Just on Paul's point about the API, I mean, I slightly worry about that because it ascribes the questions that you can ask. Inherently, if you build an API, then the questions I can ask are somewhat limited by the code. And I can totally appreciate there's a balance between full flexibility of questioning and speed of access, but I don't know where that balance is. It's an interesting question.
The API is to the CNIL, not to the companies. Of course, you can go and buy some software here that will give you a portal that very much restrains what data subjects can ask. But I'm not suggesting that's a good approach in the general. I mean, I wouldn't use that form to ask my questions. I have a field with a drop-down menu, and that's it.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's time to close. I would like to warmly thank the speakers for the very interesting presentation, also the audience for your challenging questions. We have to close the debate, but we can see that it's still a very open debate for the future. Thank you very much and have a nice day.